Trump says the Fed needs to slash interest rates fast. And when I say fast, I mean a full percentage point fast. But Powell doesn't seem to be budging. So what does that mean for our money? Will things actually get better this year, or are we just stuck sitting watching the economy go up and down on a monthly basis, just waiting for something to break? Will Trump be able to cut rates, or is Powell going to be able to hold strong? This is the latest tension that's going down, and it sounds like a new episode of Dragon Ball Z. Now, whether you're buying, investing, or somebody who's just trying to wrap your head around these headlines, the decisions they make next will affect your wallet more than you think, so let's get into it. And we'll be back in 3, 2, 1, we gone. Welcome back, family, to another episode of the First Sip Podcast. I'm your host, Dekimbe Smith, and this week, as I sip on my ginger tea, we are breaking down the latest tension that has been brewing between Donald Trump and Jerome Powell. Now, this is something I've been talking about since earlier this year when Trump came back into office, right? I said, we got to really pay attention to this because one of the biggest things that he's going to be pushing for is lower interest rates, right? We know over the past couple of years throughout Biden's administration, interest rates haven't been moving at all. And this is something that Trump said was going to be at the top of his agenda when he came back into his presidency, right? He was going to be pushing for lower rates because he thinks it's going to help stimulate the economy and get us back to where we need to be, right? Because obviously, unless you've been living under a rock, things have been tough the last couple of years. Inflation has been high, prices have been high, and it doesn't seem like they're coming down anytime soon. So what can be done? That's where Trump is saying the Fed can step up and start cutting these rates. He says for far too long, the rates have been stuck too high, and it's actually slowing down our economy. It's choking things to the point where there's no growth, right? If you saw the report that came out just recently from ADP, jobs growth was down way more than they expected in the month of May, right? I think they had about 39,000 jobs that were reported when the Dow expected about 110,000 jobs to be created within the same time. Now, it's fair to say that's a far miss, right? That's not even close. That's not even half of what they expected. And so, of course, if you're the president and you see this number coming out, people are going to start asking questions, right? They're going to be like, whoa, what's going on with the economy, right? Should we start prepping for a recession, right? Should we start, saving our money? Should we stop hiring people? Should we stop investing in certain, what should we do? Because this doesn't look like an economy that's growing, right? And that's probably the thing that's got him a little alarmed right now when he's looking at it and saying, okay, we got to start making some moves fast, because with the combination of these tariffs talks that are still going on with China and other countries around the world, and these interest rates that Jerome Powell doesn't seem to want to cut, what do we do? Are we headed towards a future where this graph, where this inflation graph just continues to go up and up and up, or is something actually going to be done before, like I said, we get to a point where the economy breaks? Now, Trump has hinted at replacing Powell in the future and even creating some sort of shadow Fed, right, with his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. And this is something, like I said, I've been paying attention to because the Fed position was created to be an independent position from the presidency, right, from politics. It's not somebody who's supposed to be, interfered with or influenced by whoever is in office at the time. But what happens now when you create, this type of position, or you start talking openly about replacing him? His job is locked in until about, I think, May of 2026. So what happens when you start talking about replacing him, and doing these things because you don't like the decisions he made? Can you still say this is a position that isn't being influenced by politics and he's only worried about the economics? Or are things starting to get a little cloudy? And honestly, I don't know, how you can just continue to put your head down and say, I'm just going to continue to do what I need to do when you have all this pressure that's growing month after month after month, especially, if the people around you who are in higher positions are saying, okay, well, we think you should be doing this. All of the economic advisors around the president say, well, we think rates should be around 3%, not the 4.25% that it currently is at. And like I said before, the last time we saw a rate cut like what they're calling for was back around March in 2020. Back when the pandemic was beginning, right? And we remember what that time period was like and what happened after that, right? It was one of the fastest inflationary times, especially when it comes to home prices, just consumer goods, right? Things were going through the roof. Now, also, there was a combination of lack of supply when it comes to consumer goods. But when it comes to housing, those rates were cut and everything started going through the roof. Same thing with with cars, right? You guys remember the price of cars started going through the roof. These things, it does have a cause and effect, right? So when you look at it, it's not as simple as saying, okay, you just cut the rate and then everything else will start booming back in the economy. No, everybody's going to be hiring. All these things are going to happen. There's a lot of different things that go on. And also when the Fed looks at what's going on in the economy, that's what he's making his decisions off of, right? It's not something that he personally sits there and says, okay, well, I don't like the president, so I'm going to go ahead and just lock this rate in until the next president comes in office. Because like I said, he didn't move the needle for Biden, and it doesn't seem like he's moving the needle much for Trump. And the last year that we saw full percentage rate cut was over the last year of Biden's presidency. So like I said, that brought us to where we are now, where mortgage rates are stable. When you're looking at some of the rates on credit cards and auto loans, those rates have definitely increased. We also have to look at how much spending is still going on with these things, right? Consumer credit card debt is through the roof, and the national debt is through the roof, right? And that's another reason why people are pushing and saying we need to refinance some of this stuff, right? We need to go ahead and cut these rates down because people can't afford the payments on them. But Powell is arguing back and saying, okay, well, if we do go ahead and cut rates prematurely, does that just now give the economy and, everybody around the country reason to say, okay, time to go start spending money again, which is going to drive prices up through the roof again if we can't match the demand that then comes, right, from that rate cut. So despite the political pressure that's happening, the Fed is saying we're not going to be influenced by all of this stuff, right? We're going to keep paying attention to the economic indicators that we've always stuck to, and we're going to make our cuts when we need to make our cuts. Now, like I said, at the beginning of this year, I thought we'd be getting a rate cut right around this time of the year, and so did everybody else. But because of the uncertainty and things that have been going on in the economy, that isn't happening right now. So we'll probably see that rate cut later in the fall, probably around September. If not then December. And that's why I said, if you're looking at this thing, hoping that, the situation is going to get better this month or next month, yeah, keep waiting, because it doesn't look like that's happening, right? And I think, honestly, when you're asking my opinion, I think the Fed is doing the right thing. I don't think we need to go ahead and cut rates right now, just like I didn't think we needed to cut rates last year when Biden was still in office, because I personally think we're at a point where things are still moving pretty steady, especially when you look at, the housing market, you look at how people are still spending. Yes, there are, like I said, a lot of people who are now putting money on consumer credit and, different loans and things like that. But what now happens when you cut rates? Do you think people are going to say, okay, no, you know what? Now things are cheaper to go ahead for me to borrow from, so I'm going to go ahead and not do that. I'm going to wait and, and just let other people. No, everybody's going to be back out there now trying to get a cheap home loan. The home prices are going to go back up through the roof. Auto prices are going to go up through the roof as soon as those auto loans go down, because that's what happens, right? Businesses notice this. Owners notice this, and they say, okay, well, time to move the prices up because there's more demand for these things now, even though the demand was still pretty high when the rates were high. So like I said, if rates are still high now and demand is still pretty strong, what does that look like, right? Doesn't look like a time for us to go ahead and cut the rates because nothing's really signaling for it to be cut. But like I said in the beginning of this episode, we also have that recent report that showed that job growth really is coming almost to a complete halt. So is this another one of those indicators when you're looking at a recession that says, okay, maybe something does need to give, right? Maybe he does need to cut rates before we run it straight into another recession. And nobody needs that right now, right? We're just coming off of a pandemic. Some people are still recovering from the last recession, right? 2008, 2010. These are not periods that are easy to bounce back from. So when we're considering these things, like I said, we really have to consider all the factors and not just say, okay, one person is right while the other person is wrong. Both sides might have a little truth to it, and we have to be able to acknowledge that and say, okay, let's look at this as a full picture and see what's really going on and what makes the most sense. But like I was just saying, I personally think that what makes the most sense right now is to continue to hold strong like Powell has been doing, because if we cut rates, I think it's going to create even more of a divide between the people who can afford it right now and the people who can't. And when I say the people who can afford it right now, I think we're getting to a position where there are less and less people who are being able to buy up more and more of what's available. And the people who are trying to get to that point aren't having enough runway, right? They don't have enough time economically to catch up, to save money, to be able to invest in these things because of all the ups and downs they've been going through the last decade, right? The last 15 years. And when you're looking at this, like I said, it is a serious conversation that people are having, that people need to continue to have and pay attention to, because this is affecting our wallet. Like I said, this is the money that we all work for, that we are trying to, make sure that we're investing wisely and spending it on things that will give us some sort of return, whether it be from an enjoyment aspect or from being able to, build up a better financial future for ourselves, right? Things that we talk about a lot on the show. And that is, like I said, why I'm always paying attention to this stuff. And that's why I think this debate does need to happen, right? Between what needs to happen this year. Now, do I think Trump needs to go ahead and replace Powell? No, I don't think that needs to happen. I don't even think that conversation needs to be had, because I think that's where you get in a position where the presidency starts looking a little crazy, and the people who are in these other seats, right, that are supposed to be the checks and balances, now have to worry about something that they shouldn't have to worry about, right? Which is, like I said, the political pressure, which I know is very hard to escape from, but I think Powell is one of those people who can kind of just put his head down and get the job done at the end of the day. And I know some people don't believe that exists at all in politics, but he looks like one of those guys who just like really did, like all his schoolwork, just did everything he needed to do to get to the top of his class. And now that he's got, the position he wants, I think he's just trying to rock out with that and not muddy the waters. Let's agree to disagree if you don't agree with me, but that's what I think. And like I said, I think he's doing a good job right now. We'll see what happens in the next 6 months. We'll see what happens a year from now. Maybe I'll make a little recap, see what happened, from since the time I had this conversation. Because like I said, this affects everybody in the country, right? Whether or not you like it, no matter what type of loan you're getting, whether or not you're just looking at the average prices, from your day-to-day shopping. These things have a trickle-down effect. So that's why I like to break it down, simplify it, and bring it to you in a way that's easily digestible, right? Something you can sip on as you go through your day-to-day life and not make it too confusing, because nobody likes to be bored by all this interest rate talk and financial stuff that usually gets filled with a whole bunch of jargon. So like I said, if you are somebody who's buying, investing, just do the simple stuff. Keep reading, keep paying attention, keep listening to podcasts like this, right? Other financial podcasts, different shows that, kind of break these things down so you can be informed and know what's going on, right? That's my mission here. The number one thing that I'm looking to do every week is just keep you informed, right? And if you don't know, I actually launched a newsletter that's an extension of the podcast. So if you guys do want to keep, stay connected on what's going on, I'll drop in some other tips in there, some other news, some content recs that I'll be getting back to. Go ahead and subscribe to it. The link will be right in the description of this. And let me know more topics that you guys want to hear about, right? So, let me know some of the things that you're reading. I do have some friends who will send me some stuff and say, hey, this will be cool to talk about. So I do appreciate that stuff because it lets me know what you're tapping into and what I should continue to make content around. So until next time, stay tuned, stay curious, and as always, enjoy your first sip.